Hey Murphy, it's Mr. Erickson. This is going to be our last PowerPoint video. We are going to cover what I kind of call the second part of Reconstruction. It deals with the actual political end of Reconstruction, which comes with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876. And it starts the second part of Reconstruction, the part of Reconstruction that is unofficial in America, and in some historians' perception is the part of Reconstruction that hasn't ended. So just to go back and make sure that we understand, the political Reconstruction comes about with the radicals sort of hijacking the Congress. We know that they impeach President Johnson. They kind of take away his power and they institute their own Reconstruction plan, which is a difficult Reconstruction plan. It's a plan that requires Southern states to tear down their governments, to rewrite their constitutions, to ensure citizenship rights in the 14th Amendment, and to make sure that blacks get the right to vote. If you remember back, we talked about 5 military districts and how the Army came in and the Army kind of ran those military districts until the states in those districts did what they were supposed to do. So in the case of Southern states, they had to do all of the radical Reconstruction. Tear down the government, rewrite their constitutions, get rid of, give citizenship rights, give the right to vote. And until they did those things, the Army was still going to be in charge of their particular states. When Hayes here becomes president, elected in 1876, the election is pretty messed up. And ultimately, Hayes does not win the popular vote in the election, but there is also not an electoral majority. So we know that this is House of Representatives ultimately decides if there's no electoral majority. And in Hayes's case, he basically kind of bargained to get some states on his side by pretty much saying, especially the southern states, if I get the votes, then we'll end this Reconstruction and we'll pull the Army out of the southern states. And so that's what happened. Hayes ultimately becomes president with a promise of ending this kind of political Reconstruction. And so in 1877, when Hayes officially takes over as president, Hayes pulls the troops out of the South and ultimately officially ends Reconstruction. Now, the troops coming out of the South is a really, really big deal. And what makes it a really, really big deal is that the troops were there not only to make sure that the southern states were in line with the rules of Reconstruction, but they also were there to protect the newest population of citizens, the former slave population, in terms of protecting their right to go to the polls and vote and all kinds of things like that. So when the Army comes out, it basically, as a country, what we're saying is that we're going to let southern states, deal with their populations. So we're going to give power to southern states to deal with their new populations. And ultimately, what becomes problematic about that is that, Southerners, they didn't just stop being racist because Reconstruction was over. They didn't stop becoming racist because the law freed the slave population. They didn't stop being racist because they lost the war. All of that stuff is going to show itself in the things that happened in this, kind of post-official Reconstruction America. So with white populations basically coming back into power and no soldiers to protect the black population, the protection of the black population falls on the government itself. So it's going to fall on the local sheriff and the local police departments. They're going to be the people who ultimately are the ones who whose job it is to make sure that the laws are carried out and followed. With the absence of the military, one of the things that we see in the South is we see a whole bunch of terrorist organizations that begin to emerge in the South. These groups are formed mostly with the intent of using fear and violence to get what they want. And at the top of the list of what these terrorist groups want, it is a desire to keep the black population from becoming a viable population, to keep the black population from earning power through representation in the vote and all kinds of things like that. Ultimately, what these groups want to do is to kind of hold this new population in a subservient role, a role like what they used to be when they were a slave population. And so, because of the absence of the military, we're going to see a broad expansion into a number of different terrorist groups. Kind of at the top of this formation of terrorist groups, we're going to find a group called the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. The Klan is going to form after the Civil War, and it is a group that forms under the idea that basically the cause of all of their problems is the black population. And the black population existing, it makes their lives more difficult. The Klan is going to very much be a group of people who feel like we should go back to the way that things used to be when the black population was held in bondage and slavery, and that's when times in the South were the best. That ultimately is what they're going to say. One of the key issues in front of the entire Southern population after the war, and we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the abolishes slavery, the 14th gives citizenship rights, the 15th gives black males 21 and older the right to vote. Once we get past those amendments added to the Constitution, the trouble for the white population in the South is, what happens if the black population uses their power to vote and they start to get representation and they start to make these moves toward being on an equal footing with the white population. The Klan is terrified of that. And so what we're going to see with the Klan is the Klan is going to do what it can do to suppress the black population. And ultimately, they're going to use the tactics of terrorism, the idea of fear and violence, in order to potentially get what it is that they want. So the Klan forms after the Civil War. Currently in 2020 America, the Klan still exists in our America. There is at least one chapter of the KKK that is active in all of our 50 states. So it hasn't gone away. And currently, the Klan spouts off about maintaining the white race and other things like that. So in that sense, when you listen to people who say that Reconstruction is still going on, one of the things that you can look at is you can look at the fact that the Klan still lives, that it's still a part of America, and their racism is one that we have not gotten rid of in our society. So the Klan is going to go into operational mode after the Civil War, and the whole idea is to ensure that the black population can't become an equal population with the white population. And ultimately, we're going to see the Klan using all kinds of methods of threats and intimidation. At its inception, we see the Klan members who are mostly showing up around the time of voting when there is an election, and we see them terrorizing black neighborhoods and burning black churches and threatening black populations who are going to the polls to vote. Um, Ultimately, over the course of time, we will see the level of violence in the Klan uh, continue to kind of grow until ultimately we see examples of something called lynching. And lynching is when a person is put to death without a trial, and the Klan becomes famous for lynching, taking a black and using that person as an example to the population. I don't know if you remember when we were talking about the abolition movement, and we talked about Nat Turner specifically, and how after Nat Turner was caught, there were beheadings and heads of slaves put on fence posts in cotton fields in Virginia, and it was a warning. And so there are a number of instances where lynchings were a kind of warning to the black population. Um, the What we know, according to the Equal Justice Initiative, which is a group that was kind of put together to study lynchings in America, we know that between 1870 and 1950, there were about 4,400 cases of lynching across the United States. Most of those cases of lynching were in southern states, but we also saw lynchings in northern states as well. And what makes these lynchings even more scary is that in almost no circumstance was a person arrested and tried for the lynching. So these lynchings occurred throughout, and they occurred in very public ways. I mean, you just look at this slide here. These are two men who have been put to death by a group of people, and it's right there in the public square. This picture, I think, comes from a town in southern Indiana. The simple fact is that when you look at this picture, what I am always amazed by is how undisturbed the people are. These are two human beings who have been murdered and are hanging in the public square of the town, and the townspeople, they don't seem to be too upset about what's going on. Almost not at all, as if this is just a regular Saturday night out on the town for the townspeople. So the impact of lynching on the populations, in a lot of cases, they considered it to be justice. The fact that these men were never arrested, that they never had the right to counsel or to have a defense or to be heard in court, that they were just kind of chosen and executed. And the people who did it, there's no word of the people who did it. So in most of the cases, it'd be pretty hard to think that the people who committed the lynchings were anonymous, right? Like nobody ever knew. They were able to secretly execute people and hang them from trees in the town square without anybody ever knowing. Obviously, a little bit of investigation in a lot of these cases would have led to the killers, and potentially them being put on trial for murdering human beings. But you really didn't see that, and lynching becomes part of the deal in terms of ordinary life in the South. Back in the Google Classroom, I gave you a link to a museum that just opened in 2018 that pays tribute to the people who have been lynched. And I'd love for you to take a look at the website. There is a museum associated with it. There is a memorial to the fallen, the people who have been lynched. There's a couple of real interesting videos in regard to those. So please, before you leave, go back and take a look at that link if you would. So we have the presence of these terrorist groups like the Klan, and they are doing, what's referred to as extra legal sort of things, things that are outside of the bounds of the law. Whether it's threatening people's lives, whether it's actually executing people in the form of lynching, whether it's some kind of intimidation. Those things fall outside of the law. And if we had real law enforcement, then those things would have been dealt with. But those are considered to be extra legal sort of things. One of the other things that we're going to see in the country, and not just in the South, but in the country, is we're going to see a number of things that are considered legal in terms of what can be done to effectively discriminate against population and discriminate legally. So what we'll see is we'll see the passage of a number of laws that are referred to as Jim Crow laws. And the Jim Crow laws were state laws. If you remember, and I hope you do, the federal government law is over everybody, and then states are allowed to have laws for their individual state if those laws don't come in conflict with federal law. So if you remember, I said that, slavery, for instance, was legal state by state. And what allowed it to be legal is that we did not write a law for the entire country about slavery until we passed the 13th Amendment in 1865. So slavery was allowed to remain and stay legal by state law. So after Reconstruction, official Reconstruction, and we have white power structures and government in the South, what they start to do is they start to take advantage of the idea that they can write laws that are state laws, and as long as the federal government doesn't respond in those ways, then they're allowed to have that particular law. And so what we see is we see a number of these laws that pop up in the South, and in some cases we're going to see Jim Crow laws that are legal and in place well into the 1950s and 60s. So a lot of these laws come from the 1870s, 1880s, and they become the state law of individual states across the country for a good, in some cases, 80 years or so. And so southern states and northern states as well are going to begin passing laws that are specifically intended to separate white populations from black populations and to effectively discriminate against those populations. These are just some Jim Crow laws that we see over the course of time. Separate waiting rooms at bus stations. So when you went into a bus station, there was a place for whites to wait at the bus station. There was a separate room for black passengers to wait at the bus station. A separate water fountain, separate restrooms, separate dining areas. There were some states that actually literally wrote laws saying that blacks and whites could not eat in the same space. There's one state, I think it was Alabama or Georgia. They actually had a law that said that if you were going to serve blacks and whites, you had to build a separate room for each race. And not only did you have to have a separate room, but you had to have a separate entrance for each race to come into that particular restaurant. There were laws designed in all cases to keep blacks and whites separated. Water fountains, public water fountains and restrooms were marked very specifically as restrooms for whites only, water fountains for whites and water fountains for blacks. Intermarriage was illegal, so it was against the law to marry a person outside of your race. Schools were separated, so there was a separate school for white students and a separate school for black students. In some cases, even teachers were segregated in the sense that if you were a white teacher, you could only teach white students. And if you were a black teacher, you could only teach black students. And these were the laws. Like cemeteries, for crying out loud, you couldn't even be dead in the same space. Separate burial. We had cemeteries that were whites only cemeteries, cemeteries for blacks only. Spaces on buses and movie theaters. Movie theaters, oftentimes they had a balcony. The blacks could sit in the balcony. The whites sat on the main floor of the theater, and in all of these, the whole intent was to separate the populations. And you can go through the Jim Crow laws. There's literally hundreds of them from states that cover just about every aspect that you can think of in terms of separating the races. And this stuff was legal ultimately to do at the time. Most of the Jim Crow laws dealt with the concept of segregation. And segregation is the separation of the races by law. So it effectively separates blacks and whites by law. And the thing here is that ultimately states are allowed to have laws like the Jim Crow laws as long as the federal government hasn't spoken in some kind of way about those particular laws. So in order to get some kind of change to a state law, there has to be a lawsuit filed. And in 1896, we get the test case for segregation. It is a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And Plessy versus Ferguson is basically the case of a guy named Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy was of mixed descent. He was biracial. Ferguson is a train conductor, and Homer Plessy gets onto a train car. I forget the state. I think it was Georgia. He gets onto a train car, and the train cars had been divided, whites only and blacks only, in different sections of the train car. Homer Plessy sat in the whites only section of the train car. The train conductor, Ferguson, asked Plessy to move to the blacks only section of the train car. Plessy refused and ultimately was arrested. So because he didn't sit in the right section according to the conductor on the train, Plessy was arrested. Well, eventually Homer Plessy is going to sue, and his lawsuit is going to go to the United States Supreme Court. So in 1896, we get the test case on whether segregation is a legal principle in America or not. And in that particular case, the United States Supreme Court sided with Ferguson, and Homer Plessy is going to lose his case. And what the Supreme Court is going to say is that it is legal. Well, this is 1896. It is legal to separate blacks and whites as long as you provide equal accommodations. So the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson creates something called separate but equal. And it basically says that it is legal to separate blacks and whites as long as you provide equal accommodations. And so for the next 60 years or so, that's basically how we go about doing segregation in America as a legal principle. So the Supreme Court basically gives legality to the idea of being able to separate people by race. There's obviously a lot of issues that come from the idea of separate but equal, and I think in the end, the biggest thing to understand is, what does equal really mean? And in a lot of circumstances, when we get to separate but equal, the white governments in the South, in states, in cities, they're the ones who are deciding what equal is. And so I think there's a difference between equality and fairness that potentially comes into play in that if the mayor of a town is a white mayor and he believes that equal means this, and the black population think that equal means something entirely different, who's going to win that argument? Well, the white mayor is going to win that argument. So what we don't typically see is we don't see a significant amount of real equality or fairness that goes into what happens in most of these cities. Now, it is important to mention that segregation is something that is consistent across the United States in that all states are allowed to segregate. In northern states segregated just like southern states did. Even in Illinois, into the 1950s, we had segregated facilities. We had separate places to sit on a bus and other things like that. So segregation was a common part of the American experience into the 1950s and 60s before we really got change. Another place where we're going to see the impact of Jim Crow laws is through the process of voting. In 1870, the 15th Amendment gave African American males 21 and older the right to vote. The thing, though, is that there's a world of difference between the law saying that you can vote and then actually being able to cast a vote. And so one of the things that we see in a lot of states across the country is we see states doing things that they can potentially do to make it difficult for the black population to vote. Ultimately, you can't stop the population from voting, but you can make it really, really hard for the population to vote. And so we're going to see a number of things that are put in place that are really specific examples of discriminating against populations and stopping them potentially from actually being able to vote, even though the law says that they can. And one of those things is called the poll tax. Poll tax is simple. It was a tax that you had to pay before you could vote. And so back in the day, if you wanted to vote, you could be taxed and you had to pay in order to actually cast a ballot. Now, one of the things that we know is that the poorest population in America at the end of slavery is the black population who just came out of slavery. Through no fault of their own, these are people who one day were slaves and the next day were free, but ultimately when they got their freedom, they didn't get a pocket full of money, they didn't get a hunk of land, they didn't get a job, because there weren't jobs available to lots of blacks because whites were still racist. So it became difficult for that population. And one of the things that potentially moves that population forward is to have representation, to have people who are willing to make laws that are going to benefit that population, help that population. And so if that population of blacks doesn't get representation, then it doesn't move forward. And there were places, especially in the South, where there were towns where the black population outnumbered the white population. But the white population was the one who was in control. And so ultimately, if you charge people to vote and you make it difficult for those people, and really in some cases it was the difference between feeding your kids and casting a vote in an election. That's how dire the circumstance was. And for most blacks in the South, they chose to feed their kids as opposed to casting a vote in an election that may or may not help them. And when the black population didn't vote, it didn't get represented, and it didn't move forward. So the poll tax was a way to discriminate against people who were poor, and the black population was the biggest of the poor populations at the time. A poll tax was intended to keep blacks from being able to vote. Um, Poll taxes were legal in the United States all the way up until 1964. We actually passed an amendment to the Constitution to get rid of poll taxes. Another way that Jim Crow could affect voting was through something called the literacy test. Literacy test was a test of your ability to read and write before you could cast a vote. Basically, the idea was to effectively stop blacks from voting because they were unable to read and write. We know that there were black code laws that made it illegal to teach slaves how to read and write. And so when we get to the freedom of the slave population, we get mostly a population that is not literate, that does not know how to read and write. And as a result of that, that first generation, second generation out of slavery is an illiterate population. It's a population where not a lot of former slaves knew how to read and write. And then as we move further along and we start getting into education and you start passing Jim Crow laws saying that white teachers can't teach black students, and you have a black population that is illiterate, who's supposed to be the teacher? It's going to take a while for the black population to have the access to education to become a literate population to teach people in their population how to read and write. Up until that point, the literacy test potentially is a way to say, you know what, you have to know how to read and write before you can vote. How do you even know what you're going to vote for? So they made these tests, and the tests were they were crazy in that it was almost impossible for a lot of people in the population to be able to pass the tests. They did things like read Section 1 of the Constitution and then explain what it means. There's a lot of us today who have had the ability to read and write who could not explain what Section 1 of the Constitution says. So they made it difficult. Read a page from Shakespeare and explain what just stuff like that. That was incredibly difficult. But there was a problem with the literacy test for the white population, and that's that a lot of the white population in the South, they were illiterate too. Now they had access to education, but they never learned how to read and write either. And so potentially the literacy test could hurt the white population as well. But they figured a way around that. They wrote a new law. The new law is called the grandfather clause. And it basically said if your grandfather voted, then you don't have to pass a literacy test. So this is good for the white population because most of them had grandfathers who voted. The problem was for the black population, this wasn't helpful at all because if you think about it, coming out of slavery, how many first generation free people do you think had grandfathers who voted in elections? Well, they were slaves, so obviously they didn't vote. So it's going to take a number of generations just to get a grandfather in the black population in the South who had actually voted in an election. So the literacy test was going to hurt the black community, and it wasn't going to hurt the white community at all. Lots of different examples of what a literacy test looked like. I could take a minute and try this. So this is my literacy test for you, and all you have to do is read this. You only get one chance to read it. You have to read it out loud, and you can't stumble over any word. So you can't mispronounce a word. You can't go back. You have to just keep reading through without making any kind of mistake. That's part one of the literacy test. So you get one shot. Read this whole thing out loud. Don't mispronounce any words. And if you do make it through, all you have to do then is explain what all of this means. You can't look anything up. You just have to explain what it means. And if you could do those things, then you could vote. I feel like there's probably a number of people who, can't cleanly read this one time through. I will tell you this. In the second line, it is habeas corpus. That's how you pronounce that. If you pronounce it any other way, your literacy test is over. Once you get through it, then all you have to do is explain it. So think about being, second generation out of slavery who has had absolutely no access to education whatsoever. And they say, all right, you want to vote? All you got to do is read this. Almost impossible for that to happen. And so because you couldn't pass the literacy test, you couldn't vote. So this is going to be our last thing here. And our last thing here is another example of discrimination in something called sharecropper. A sharecropper is a person who worked the land for a share of the profit, and kind of in the end, this is probably the best job that a black out of slavery potentially is going to get. One of the things that we saw in the South is, we used to have all these plantations, cotton plantations and other things like that, and the slaves are the ones who did the work on the plantations. And so after slavery is abolished and we get rid of slavery, we still have all the land of the plantations, but now the plantation owner doesn't have a workforce, no slaves to do the work. So what that plantation owner does is kind of takes the plantation, divides it up into parts, and then he sort of is going to kind of rent out different sections of his land. He's going to bring in people to work the land. Those are the sharecroppers. And their job is to basically do the same job that they did when they were slaves, except for now they are quote unquote free people. And the deal basically worked like this. If you follow the cycle there, it starts with the sharecropper getting this piece of land. The sharecropper gets seed, typically in the form of cotton. And basically, he says the deal with the landowner is that the sharecropper will work the piece of land. And then at the end, when the land is harvested, there is a split between the sharecropper and the landowner. Sharecropper is going to get half for the work that they did in tending to the crop, and the landowner is going to get half because it's his land. So the sharecropper comes to the piece of land. Typically, there's a little cabin or house built on the piece of land for the sharecropper to live in with his family. But the sharecropper basically comes to this arrangement with nothing, with no money, nothing. Typically, the sharecropper is allowed to go to the local general store and buy the things that they need. Most of that stuff is bought on credit. So because they didn't have any money, they go to the store. The store offers them credit to buy the things that they need to live on the land and work the crop. And the deal is that when the crop comes in at the end of the year, then they pay back their debt. So the sharecropper in step 3 plants and harvests the crop. In step 4, the harvest comes in and they sell the crop. The sharecropper gets half of the earnings, but then the sharecropper has to pay off his debt to the store. And typically, when they're settling up their debt, what tends to happen is that the landowner charges the sharecropper even more than originally he had said. And so a lot of times, by the time you get to the end of the year and the sharecropper gets their half of the profit, when they pay back everything that they owe, and whatever the landowner tells them that they owe, they typically don't have enough money to stay on the land. So the landowner basically says, all right, well, we'll let this slide. And in thing 6 there, the sharecropper decides to give a bigger percentage of their half to the landowner in order to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And so then the next year comes and they do the same thing, and by the time they get to the end, they owe the landowner even more. And so they get less of the profit. Next year, they get even less of the profit. And by the time you get to about, 10 years into this relationship, the sharecropper is basically working for nothing. And to me, that sounds a lot like being a slave. Now, in some circumstances, some people say, well, why didn't they just, quit and leave the land? Well, they didn't quit and leave the land because they had signed a contract to farm the land. If they don't stay and farm the land, then they go to jail because they broke the contract. There's no value in that. So one of the things that we will see that happens a lot in this relationship is that a lot of times the dad, sharecropper, a lot of circumstances actually left the farm, went to the north and got a job on the railroad or something like that to make money to send back to his family who stayed on the land. The moms kind of became the farmers. They became the sharecroppers. The dad had to go off and work another job just so that they could stay on the land. So the arrangement was an arrangement that absolutely took advantage of the sharecropper and ultimately left them with nothing. And in a lot of instances, this is the best job that you're going to get as a Southerner. All right, so that's pretty much it for us. Go back to Google Classroom and take a look at the museum, the Equal Initiative Museum on lynching. I gave you a separate link to that. Take some time to look at that. I've got a question or two for you to answer, so make sure that you have that done. This is going to be our last kind of video PowerPoint. Next week, it'll be about just kind of making sure everything's wrapped up and that you have completed all of the things that you've needed to do, especially the question for each week. You need to make sure that you have all of those done.